everyone. The Coordinating Center for the National Drug Early Warning System, sponsored by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, is pleased to welcome you to our Fall 2019 NDEWS Presents webinar series. The NDEWS PI is Dr. Eric Wish, and the NIDA project scientist is Moira O'Brien, and I believe that both of them are in the audience with us this afternoon. My name is Erin Artigiani. I'm the NDEWS Co-I, and I'm joined by Barbara Kerr, Marwa Al-Nasir, and we will be the facilitators for this webinar. We are part of the NDEWS Coordinating Center team, which is based here at the Center for Substance Abuse Research at the University of Maryland in College Park. For those who are interested, you can find detailed information about NDEWS, recordings of prior webinars, and invitations to future webinars, and also copies of the study that is being presented this afternoon on our website at www.ndews.org. www.ndews.org. You will also find instructions for how to join our NDEWS network and participate in ongoing discussions with nearly 1,600 experts and concerned citizens from across the United States and many other countries. So if you're not already a member, I hope you will join us and participate in our ongoing discussions in topics like toxicology, epidemiology, and drug policy. We developed the NDEWS Presents webinars to work with leading substance abuse experts to explore emerging drugs and timely drug-related topics and innovative data sources. This month, we are very excited to be joined by Dr. Andrea Lopez, Department of Anthropology at the University of Maryland College Park, and Dr. Eric Geisler, Director of Medical Services for the Serenity Lane treatment program. They will be discussing the results of an NDEWS hotspot study conducted to explore methamphetamine and opioid co-use in Oregon. CSER has been developing urine testing protocols through a project supported by the Office of National Drug Control Policy, and actually conducted an earlier study with Dr. Geisler and his team at Serenity Lane, which was released earlier this year. The results of these urinalyses led to the NDEWS hotspot being presented today. This webinar will be approximately 90 minutes long, and we encourage you to submit questions during and after the presentation. Please do not raise your hand though, because we can't call on you. Instead, please post your questions in the Q&A box. We will hold a Q&A session after the presentation. Dr. Lopez, Dr. Geisler, Barbara, Marwa, and I will do our best to get to all of your questions. And we will also be happy to communicate with you after the webinar if you send us an email to the general NDEWS email address, ndews@umd.edu. A recording of this webinar and a copy of our presenter slides will be made available on our website, which again is www.ndews.org. Thank you, and we hope you enjoy this webinar. Dr. Geisler, I will turn things over to you.
Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Dr. Eric Geisler, and I'm the medical director at Serenity Lane Drug and Alcohol Treatment Center, located in Coburg, Oregon, just north of Eugene, Oregon. And when you're from Oregon, everybody wants to know if you're an Oregon duck, and I always say I'm a penguin from Youngstown State. And I went to medical school in Northeast Ohio, and our mascot's the walking whale. I'm board certified in drug and alcohol addiction treatment, as well as family practice. I also have long-term recovery. This is me receiving an M&M for every day of 20 years of continuous recovery. At Serenity Lane, we've been treating drug and alcohol problems since 1973, and our motto is saving lives and putting families back together since 1973. Our facility is located in Coburg, Oregon. We have a 20-bed detox hospital unit and 80 beds of residential care on our main campus. We also have 8 outpatient offices around the state of Oregon that feed patients into our detox and residential services, as well as following up with outpatient services after residential treatment. Some disclosures: I have been a paid consultant to Alchemies for Vivitrol, and have had dinner presentations from Individor, the manufacturer of Sublocade. What I'd like to tell you is that the majority of the samples that we collected were from Lane County, Oregon, where the city of Eugene is located, and home of the University of Oregon. and a large number of the samples were also from Roseburg, Oregon, which is 75 miles south of Eugene in a sort of isolated rural community. So the results that we received were from those two communities mostly. And then I'll let Dr. Lopez take it over from there.
Okay, so I want to thank Dr. Geisler so much for the introduction and also for being so welcoming. It's to his credit and also the credit of the staff at Serenity Lane that we were able to complete this study that I'm going to be sharing results from today. So really excited and looking forward to a discussion based on what are these initial findings from this qualitative hotspot study that we did as part of the larger NDEWS project. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in. I just want to give everyone a quick overview of the presentation today. So I want to discuss, for some context, what were the original report findings, which happened in March of 2019. And these are the things that essentially prompted the NDEWS staff to think about the importance of the hotspot study. The next is that I want to talk about what our study looked like and what the rationale was based on those initial findings from the original report. I'll talk a little bit about our qualitative methodologies more broadly for the study and why they were so critical within this context. I'm going to discuss a little bit about my ethical commitments to research specifically with people who use drugs and how I see that playing out in the interview context and in the kinds of data that we end up collecting. Then I'll lead into discussing our key findings and what I see as kind of emerging public health implications, but also I think with so much of the discussion going on nationally about this issue that I think we have some real work to do in terms of discussing the real magnitude of some of the emergent public health implications. And then we'll have time for questions and discussion after that. Okay. So again, just wanted to give credit to our funding source, which is through the NDEWS study supported by NIDA. And you can see our award number here for more information. Okay, so just a little bit about the original study findings. You may or may not be familiar with this report. This is linked on the NDEWS website. The citation is below, and if you get this PowerPoint, you'll have access to the direct link to that study. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of context about that. Okay, so essentially the initial study was called Drug Early Warning Signals, Serenity Lane, Coburg, Oregon. And this was, as Dr. Geisler mentioned, done at the Coburg Inpatient Hospital Unit, which is a medically supported withdrawal program. And so what happened in this study is de-identified urine specimens essentially underwent expanded testing as part of this analysis. And there were some key findings that are really critical, which ended up prompting this hotspot study. So there were 103 specimens, and of those, 61% were found to contain methamphetamine in that expanded analysis. Methamphetamine positive specimens came from people on average who were 5 years younger than those who tested negative for methamphetamine. And then another key finding was that non-fentanyl opioids were detected almost 3 times as often in methamphetamine positive specimens compared to methamphetamine negative specimens. So this was the original data from that original study. Again, if you're interested in kind of hearing more about the intricacies of that, the link is available there on my PowerPoint. I'm not going to discuss more of the intricacies of those findings, but discuss more sort of what happened and what prompted then the qualitative hotspot study. So of course we say, okay, we look at this data and NDEWS staff along with Dr. Geisler and others who were involved say, okay, is this an emerging trend? Is this something that we need to sort of have our eyes on? Are there trends that we need to be aware of? Are there important motivations that people who use drugs are using in this context as they're entering treatment? And so this is what initially prompted the hotspot study. So essentially we're interested in, are there emerging trends or important motivations essentially in the use of methamphetamine? We're interested in knowing if there are these trends or motivations in the use of methamphetamine in combination with opioids. And so we, through the NDEWS team, essentially assembled a team which included myself, a medical anthropologist, and then Mary Howe, a direct service provider and researcher. And so we each have approximately 2 decades of working with people who use drugs, either in a research or direct service capacity. And so we were sort of primed and ready to go based on the kind of emerging research questions that came from that initial report. So what happened in conjunction with Serenity Lane staff and NDEWS staff is that we coordinated 2 site visits, which took place between May 29th and 30th at the Serenity Lane Treatment Center and then the Serenity Lane Hospital and Residential Treatment Center. So those were 2 sites. And again, the staff of Serenity Lane really facilitated us sort of coordinating these kind of rapid ethnographic data collection days that happened over the course of those 2 days that we visited the sites. Okay. So this was just circulating in some of my social media yesterday, and just wanted to kind of give a heads up that this recent paper was published just on September 11th. And so this is a short report that was released in the journal Addiction, and just wanted to point out the kind of ways in which our discussion today can be contextualized within what people are talking about as a broader trend that's happening in the United States related to methamphetamine use among people who are entering, in this case for heroin treatment, but among people who are using opioids more broadly. So essentially this study is finding that there's this increase in methamphetamine use among heroin treatment admissions, and looked at data actually between 2008 to 2017 and came out with the conclusion that in fact methamphetamine use among heroin treatment admissions in the US increased from 1 in 50 to 1 in 12 admissions in 2017. So we have some big data to think about in terms of potentially some kind of interesting national trend or dynamic that is going on with respect to this sort of question of interest. So then what we have today is a way to sort of really contextualize a finding like that within a local context and sort of think through, okay, so what does this mean for people who might have been counted in these larger type studies, but then what are some of these motivations and strategies that people who are using drugs are using in terms of this combination of methamphetamine and opioids in conjunction. So when we talked about the hotspot study and creating the study design, we had essentially 2 primary aims. So the first aim was to assess experiences, motivations, and outcomes of combined methamphetamine and opioid use from the perspective of people who are current or former drug users. And then our second aim was to assess the experience, motivation, and outcomes of combined methamphetamine and opioid use from the perspective of clinicians and direct service providers who engage with people who use drugs or people in drug treatment. So those were our 2 sort of guiding aims for the study. So I want to talk a little bit about methodology. So this is a qualitative study with elements of rapid ethnographic assessment. So I can discuss that piece a little bit more, but we did, sort of an office-based or interview-based was the primary mode of data collection, but we did a little bit of ethnographic research sort of around that within the community as well. We partnered, as I mentioned, with leadership to arrange purposeful recruitment of patients and staff who had experiences within our realm of interest. So the eligibility for patients was that they had to be 18 years or older, they had to have a history of methamphetamine or opioid use, and they were enrolled in a Serenity Lane program. And then for staff, similarly, 18 years or older, staff member at one of Serenity Lane's programs, and knowledgeable about methamphetamine or opioid use in the community. So we did 2 site visits, 1 focus group with patients where we had 6 participants, 2 focus groups with staff with a total of 12 participants, and then we did semi-structured interviews with a total of 6 participants outside of that over the course of the 2 days site visits. I also just sort of want to note that many of the staff people, their interviews sort of functioned very similarly to the patient interviews where we had, the ability of people in recovery to really share deep contextualized information about this specific issue. So all of the interviews were incredibly valuable. All participants underwent informed consent, and everybody at the focus groups was provided refreshments. We went big and got very nice voodoo donuts, which I'm sure Dr. Geisler remembers. And then people who participated in the one-on-one interview were paid $25 in cash for their participation at that time. So those are kind of the basic sort of methods that we used. I want to talk a little bit first about just sort of my primer that I give every time as a qualitative researcher working with this population. My ethical research commitments in terms of doing this work, and also in particular thinking about kind of the enhanced attention to those commitments that has to come when you're doing very rapid ethnographic work. So going into a community where people don't know you, you don't know them, but you sort of appear, and the kinds of things you really have to have on your radar in terms of those research commitments of engagement with populations. So for myself as an anthropologist, as a public health researcher more broadly, I always lead with putting directly on the table that research has this problematic history among vulnerable populations, such as people who use drugs, communities of color, and people experiencing poverty. And so this is sort of my baseline kind of engagement as a researcher to say, okay, so if we know this fact, then how do we proceed from that point in terms of engaging with our research participants? So for me, there's very much hold to the idea that trust is earned, not given. So very much, the idea that participants have the opportunity to sort of shut down an interview at any time based on how they're feeling about the particular type of engagement, but really leading in and being aware of those things that might be potentially triggering, for people who use drugs, people experiencing poverty, and essentially communities that have been kind of wronged by research, over the course of history. Also, I lead by acknowledging that documenting histories of trauma and suffering requires particular sensitivity and training. So we have training in trauma-informed interviewing skills, and are really mindful again of the particular types of qualitative probing that we use, so as not to, unnecessarily traumatize the interview participants. Be really mindful that, we're hearing very much experiences typically of trauma and suffering related to people's drug use or related to people's, experience of managing recovery or other things. And so just being very mindful, again, of those trauma-informed skills and being sure that we're doing kind of enhanced work to protect participants in those contexts. I also lead with the idea of acknowledging that the voices of the most impacted by drug use are a critical part of how we understand the overdose crisis or any type of intervention. So again, coming in as a PhD level researcher sure is one form of expertise, but also acknowledging that in that room with me is, another form of expertise that is the voices of those most impacted who have as much to say in terms of developing an evidence base as anyone else does in terms of how we understand how these issues really play out. So really history and experience matter for the evidence base. And even as we sort of get into these narratives, really thinking through how those things sort of stand in conjunction as evidence worthy of anything else and how we come to understand some of these problems. Okay, so given that, I also want to sort of discuss a little bit about the approach of using qualitative methods, what they are and what they are not, as a way to sort of get into being able to say, well, what are we able to kind of assert given the data that we have from this study? So the first thing is that, again, numbers are one form of evidence, but that people's experiences and voices are another critical voice of evidence that we need. So again, if we see an emerging problem, the quantitative evidence that something is happening in terms of a trend is critical, but then also this idea of people's experiences and voices as being this other critical form of evidence must stand also in conjunction with what we consider the evidence base. So this is especially true for vulnerable populations, such as people who use drugs, who might not engage with institutions as regularly, whose voices might not be counted in other types of studies. And so just this idea that, again, experiences and voices are this critical part of the evidence base that we have to be really mindful of collecting. So qualitative research and analysis can be systematic. And what it does give us is deep experiential narratives about why people make the choices they do and the barriers, challenges, and hardships they face as they navigate those systems. So people's experiences, very systematically collected, are important evidence. And this is really a critical step in designing future larger quantitative studies and also understanding the implementation of policy as it plays out at the local level. So one of the things we're going to be discussing shortly is kind of the importance of some local contextual information in framing out the findings that we ultimately found here as a result of these site visits. And so just again, thinking about how there is always a story that potentially alludes to broader patterns, and then there's always an important story that it sort of alludes to what are kind of important localized patterns. So we can talk later about this question of generalizability, but again, want to say for the purposes of a qualitative study, the methodological strength is really in the small sample sizes that allow for us to explore research questions using deeply experiential and localized data that both speaks to broader patterns, but that is incredibly relevant locally and contextually. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and move forward, just being mindful of time with our results of the study. So we do this site visit, we come and show up with lots of donuts, which honestly we ate the majority of at the end of those site visits, but it was still quite enjoyable. So I wanted to say that we came up with 3 key domains as a part of the results from this qualitative data. So the first one is that we found regional or geographic findings that were important for understanding patterns of methamphetamine use locally. So we'll start with this section first. And then I'm going to discuss the second finding, that forms of stigma related to methamphetamine, opioids, and the use of medication-assisted treatment were themes that we consistently heard both among the patient population and then also among the staff population. So the stigma piece is kind of a critical part of this story as well. And then third, I want to talk about the rationales and motivations regarding the co-use of methamphetamine and opioids that people talked about in quite a bit of detail in our data set. So these are the 3 key domains that we're going to focus on today. And I'm going to start first with our regional and geographic findings. So the first thing that we begin to hear about is that participants really identified these regional hotspots where methamphetamine use was particularly prevalent. So in Southern Oregon, in the Roseburg region, and then also in Springfield, Oregon. Excuse me. So these are the particular regional hotspots that participants really identified as critical. So in these regional hotspots, people discussed that there was widespread methamphetamine use, including intergenerational and family use. So again, this is one of those strengths where we get to really hear not only about the stories of participants that are discussing their contemporary drug use, but also then hear a little bit about, what those sort of family histories, what this intergenerational portrait of substance use looks like in this area. So we heard many narratives about how methamphetamine use is often tied to intergenerational trauma. So this idea of having kind of adverse childhood experiences and also just things that people really recalled about their methamphetamine use as being tied to sort of familial patterns or familial patterns of trauma or exposure to trauma over the life course. Also, one contextual aspect was that in Southern Oregon, we heard narratives about methamphetamine being really critical to help with physically demanding work. So this was something that people described as really important in the logging industry, so that people were sort of using methamphetamine as a way to get through that physically demanding work. But that decline in that industry had really led people to turn from methamphetamine use on their own to methamphetamine as an income generating strategy, and also something that they recreationally used. So we asked these questions, and being from different parts of the country, always really enjoy sort of hearing what are the local idioms. So people describe methamphetamine locally as shit, as white, were just some of the local idioms in terms of describing methamphetamine. Okay. So moving right along, I want to discuss in a little bit more depth about how local context and temporality really matter. So we have in the original data urine samples that were specifically collected between December 2017 and February 2019. So one of our jobs as qualitative researchers was to really say, okay, well, we're here now, right? We know from the report some of the trends that were observed in that initial data collection, but now as qualitative researchers, we have to say, okay, here we are locally, what was significant locally about that time period? So we did that both with patients and staff as a way to begin to contextualize the data and to understand, is there something specific here that we need to be mindful of that needs further inquiry? What's going on? And the best people to kind of fill us in on that are the people locally who had experiences in that time period. So we found that this was actually a period with different subpopulations of patients at Serenity Lane. So because of insurance issues and contracting with the Oregon Health Plan, there was this contract over this period of time where essentially people who were enrolled in the Oregon Health Plan were now participating in treatment services at Serenity Lane. And so this brought an influx of patients, specifically from the Roseburg, Oregon geographic area. And that this population was a little bit unique in terms of its complex treatment needs. So it was a population that had long histories of homelessness, histories of involvement in street drug scenes, and histories of trauma and sexual violence. So really a lot of complex treatment needs that were sort of intersecting in terms of the treatment experience with these kind of multiple intersecting adversities and issues that might kind of play in to how somebody engages with treatment. And so this was a really key insight for us, was to say, okay, well, so we have this point in time data from the original report, and then now we're seeing that there's this emerging ethnographic reality with respect to understanding that there was in fact kind of an important shift or an important event that took place at this time that might help to contextualize, or at least open up a space to contextualize some of those findings that were a result of the initial study. Okay, so the second primary finding was related, as I said, to this issue of stigma. So stigma in relationship to methamphetamine use, opioid use, and then also in relationship to the co-use of methamphetamine and opioids. So we heard this sort of across the board in terms of staff sort of narratives about experiences of patients, and then also within patient narratives, this idea that methamphetamine users were highly stigmatized in healthcare settings and social contexts across the board. So again, this was not unique, but what was unique was that there were specific narratives about methamphetamine users that people spoke to as being, uniquely stigmatizing towards that population of people who use drugs. So one person said, quote, "You kind of feel sorry for the opiate addict, like, oh, they have pain and they're covering it up. They're not hurting anybody. They're just sitting there." Whereas meth, it's like, that's a psychotic person. That's a dangerous, insane person. So another person discussed this specifically in relationship to accessing healthcare services. So they said, quote, "I've seen people locally turned away because they're meth users from emergency care in a life-threatening situation that wasn't related to their meth use. It's heartbreaking." So I wanted to illuminate this theme of the relationship to discrimination based on kind of perceived narratives of socioeconomic status of methamphetamine users. So this idea of there being a connection, at least how in terms of how people kind of described that interaction between drug of choice and socioeconomic status, that there was this kind of relationship in terms of stigma, stereotyping, and forms of exclusion, with this idea that methamphetamine use was connected to particular behaviors that were then stereotyped as being linked to people from particular socioeconomic backgrounds. So again, just thinking about the operation of stigma for this population as kind of cross-cutting all of those issues, including drug of choice, including socioeconomic status, and that those things really came together in terms of how people experience stigma. Okay. So moving right along in terms of this second batch in terms of this third batch of findings. So this idea that methamphetamine is a safer alternative. So again, this is something where the narratives of the local context became really important and interesting. So we begin to hear narratives that there was, in terms of the local context, a lot of trauma related to significant loss from overdose spikes in recent years. So people really discuss this, that essentially, you know, over the last 10, 20 years, people had really experienced significant loss from overdose spikes in recent years. And we heard from different people that, you know, there were reports of 24 patients lost in that era from fatal overdoses. So this idea was very much on the minds of people as they were talking, saying, look, we've been through this period where people have experienced extensive trauma, extensive loss in relationship to fatal overdoses. And so the discussion of the relationship between methamphetamine and opioid use is very much contextualized within what is this local reality of pain and loss over the last sort of period of people's memory. So people really describe this idea that, okay, well, within the context of all of this, we're perceiving methamphetamine as being a safer alternative to heroin potentially. There's some nuances of how that plays out, but in general, one of the key findings was that we did hear people describing methamphetamine is perceived as safer. So there's some nuances. So one person said, I think when I was using, it was just the possibility of overdose that comes with heroin. And with meth, you're just gonna get really weird. But in that delusional state, that did seem like the safer alternative for me. So that's one example of a narrative of that sort of strategy. Another person said, I think a lot of people who start out with heroin feel like meth is for some reason, safer alternative. So they go, well, I'm not doing heroin anymore, but I can start doing meth. And then they end up wanting the heroin still, so they end up doing them both. So again, this is a strategy that likely, you know, people from different areas of the country would have about this notion, especially within, you know, so much publicity and context and discussion about the overdose crisis. But here locally, we have these types of narratives tied to the specific period of loss and memory of loss in relationship to fatal overdoses in the area. Okay. So we also heard narratives about people using methamphetamine to detox or titrate heroin. So essentially, again, we had people describe sort of narratives about where they were wanting to self-manage detoxification from heroin. And that self-management ranged, you know, from people who may not have had access to treatment or weren't ready to be engaged in treatment in a structured way. So these are some narratives about kind of self-managed detoxification, not necessarily from people who had planned on or were entering treatment of any kind at that point. So we heard about these strategies of using methamphetamine to really detox or titrate. So one person said, they said to themselves, this needs to happen. So they were talking about stopping their own heroin use. They go on, I don't want to stop doing drugs. So I'm going to try to do this, to do as much of this methamphetamine as possible to stay up past the point where I feel like I'm going to die from heroin withdrawal. And then you lose some days in there, and then all of a sudden you're off heroin. So this was very much a conscientious strategy on the part of this person to say, if I'm going to get through that kind of hellish period of withdrawal, methamphetamine is going to play a role in there, in particular if I'm not using any kind of medication-assisted withdrawal regimen. If I'm here just sort of doing it on my own, then methamphetamine has a role to play for me kind of within this context of detoxing. So another person said, my husband was an opiate addict. He never really got too deep into heroin, thank God, but oxycodone, 6 years. We started using it, methamphetamine, more because when he was coming down and withdrawing off heroin, we couldn't get any pills. So I would go, here you go, so you're not so sick. So she's giving him so he's not so sick from opioid withdrawal. And she goes on, and then of course I took it, the methamphetamine, along with him. But that's how I usually see meth, and I think that heroin and meth pretty much go hand in hand. So these are two examples of kind of really specific strategies around the detoxification or titrating from heroin as a way to manage the suffering that happens for people who use drugs in the context of withdrawal. Okay, so continuing with detoxing or titrating heroin, There were sort of practical everyday reasons based on needs as well for people that they discussed in terms of why they would be motivated to mix heroin and methamphetamine together. So one person, and this was actually quite common, people talked about it being sort of a matter of functionality. So one person said, I think it's a functional situation. I can't be completely out of it. So they're doing the speedballing or the mixing that they can get to get themselves functional, but at the same time be under the influence of opioids. So as a way to sort of get up and get moving type situation and be functional in terms of managing everyday activities. So another person says, I've seen them do both, where they do speedballs, goofballs, whatever you want to call it. And I've seen it where I've heard people say that they use heroin and they needed a pickup, so they would do meth and vice versa. In my personal experience, I would do heroin and I would need something to get me up and be productive, if you want to call it productive, and reduce my anxiety. I've also heard a lot of people detoxing off heroin and they use meth. So again, this combination both of the detoxing motivation, but then also this idea of, stimulants along with opioids in order to sort of get through kind of a normal day. Okay. So those are the kind of three large areas of findings that are outlined in the report. But I also want to point you and encourage you to really look at the case studies in the report, which we have 3 case studies kind of included, which just include, in addition to the specific data that speaks to the combination of methamphetamines and opioids in combination, that there's 3 case studies in there that really give a little bit of background information about each person, kind of their drug use history, a little bit how they got into it, and kind of how they started using methamphetamine and heroin in conjunction. So there's 3 case study findings, and I just want to encourage you to take a look at those. So one case study talks about a 27-year-old patient who recently transitioned to using meth and heroin together every day by injecting heroin and smoking meth. So this is a good example too of, even within the ideas of thinking, well, if people are goofballing or speedballing, that they might be injecting together. But this is also a nuance about someone describing that they would inject heroin and then they would smoke meth. So within that, there's the nuances of how people are actually liking to use them in conjunction. So this 27-year-old person told us, quote, I ended up relying on meth a lot more because I wasn't getting high so much off of heroin anymore. Because with heroin, you get to the point fairly quickly, if you're using a lot consistently, where it stops working as well as it did before. Or obviously build a tolerance and you don't really feel so much like you're getting high anymore. But later on, it was more like, do a shot of dope and get well and be good. But then I'm not really high. So then I would, a little while later, start doing more meth just to try to add something to that. But the same thing happens with meth, where it's not as effective. So yeah, I kind of went from, both going together, being really intense, to me trying to use meth just to do a little something extra, because neither of them were working all that well. So that's sort of an idea that encompasses this, you might sort of toggle back and forth based on really what you need in relationship to your drug tolerance, or in relation to what you need in terms of managing either daily activities or other symptoms going on in your life. So this is from a second case study. The previous one, sorry, didn't have gender, so that was a man. This one is a 24-year-old woman who used methamphetamine and heroin to be functional. So this woman really had, I interviewed this woman, and it was a lengthy interview with a lot of descriptions of trauma, a lot of descriptions of, exposure to violence in relationship to a partner that she had over the years, who was very much connected to her drug use. And so she had shared a lot of trauma within the context of this interview, and then also her motivations for drug use really being sort of tied to how she needed to manage emotional issues and trauma. So she says, my goal of using heroin was to nod out, which is why it's super triggering that people can nod out in groups where others are on MAT. So she was talking about being in groups with some people on MAT who are nodding out. But I still had to function and go to work and drive, and I'd be rolling down the windows and smacking myself trying to wake up to drive. So that's when the meth came in, and it bounced me out to a sense. The meth would, make your heart race, make you not hungry, make you awake. So it kind of had the adverse effect of the heroin, which is why I used them together. But everyone I knew did heroin and always did meth too. So she's talking again about that kind of functional aspect in relationship to her drug use. So a third case study was a 28-year-old man whose drug of choice was co-use. This was kind of like a golden interview because really his entire kind of drug use history and narrative was in relationship to specifically his desire to use methamphetamine and heroin in conjunction. So everything that he said was really applicable to kind of our broader research questions. So he said, quote, "That's why I don't like shooting up meth, because I feel like every time I overamp. And then I'm immediately just weird, delusional. So what got me into using last time, I was doing a lot of meth by myself, which I absolutely hated, but I needed to use. So by the end of about 4 or 5 days, I was like, okay, I need to go to sleep now and feel normal. So I was like, I'm going to pick up some heroin and sleep it off. Anytime I do meth by itself, I don't stop using it unless I have heroin." So he had described like his sort of mode of drug use was really going on long runs. So he would have these periods where he was, using meth over a course of several days and not sleeping, not eating, and feeling like he was entering these kinds of delusional places where he hadn't been hydrating, he hadn't been eating. And so really the way for him to stop from those periods of intense use was to use heroin, and using it consciously as a strategy to say, okay, I'm putting a pause button on this and I'm going to kind of reorient for a little bit. And heroin was his solution for doing so in that realm. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about conclusions. So I want to just say, like, from kind of a larger perspective or a broader perspective about thinking of the benefit of doing these kind of hotspot qualitative site visits to supplement initial quantitative data, that we found that there was indeed this scientific value added. So that really, when we looked at the original data from the original report, we were able to say, okay, we have this quantitative data and qualitative data in combination, which give us kind of new insights or a value added on what we might have gotten from either one in isolation. So this one sort of exposes a partial picture of the initial quantitative study. So again, I always say that, that temporal and that local context, so time and place, always matter in terms of how we're able to understand or contextualize any quantitative data. So we were able to do that. We get the value added of experiential evidence to our understanding of a potentially emerging drug trend. So those nuanced decision-making, the savviness and the strategies that people use to manage and make the best out of what situation comes to them is a critical part of the evidence base for how we begin to understand how we might implement policy or programming that addresses the needs of people who are co-using. And then, of course, as I said, the temporal issue. So again, drug use patterns have to be situated within some local context, because if we didn't have that important critical contextual information about, perhaps a subpopulation of people that had different needs that were entering Serenity Lane at that time, we might not have a full portrait if we tried to particular sort of strategies related to the contemporary population. So there's something important about the local context and the time, contextualizing those findings to say that there's something emerging going on, but with some nuance that needs to be attended to. And so this also sort of led us to think, okay, well, is there an important hotspot site study in Roseburg? So if this was sort of representative of patients from a particular area, then is there sort of more work to be done, a related hotspot site that might allow us to continue to shed light on this issue as it emerges. Okay, so some initial implications for public health. this idea that we need to think about the development of harm reduction strategies that can serve people who are primarily co-using methamphetamine and opioids. So, you know, what are the unique needs of someone, for instance, who very consciously is going back and forth between using stimulants, whether it be meth or others, and opioids? What are some of those sort of harm reduction needs that people have? And that these need to build on the expertise of people who use drugs. So I think even in this short site visit, I was immensely impressed by the fact that, you know, people have their strategies and they're making conscious decisions to kind of serve themselves and take care of themselves. So these are the people who are really actively strategizing around co-use and what it means. So again, if we're thinking about any potential emergent public health strategies, you know, that those things need to be informed by like the realities of why people co-use methamphetamine and heroin together. And that there's still a need for enhancement really of harm reduction strategies for people who use methamphetamine, particularly in areas where there isn't already a harm reduction infrastructure. So this is true in other places where you have, you know, robust syringe exchange programs and other things that are going on in terms of serving people who use drugs. But in places where there isn't as much of that kind of robust infrastructure, that there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of thinking through what are the harm reduction strategies that we need to really develop and make accessible for people who use methamphetamines, particularly in areas where there might not already be an existing infrastructure. Okay. So with that, I want to go through a few acknowledgements and gratitude before we get to the Q&A portion of our discussion. So really do want to thank the patients and staff at Serenity Lane who participated. Everybody was incredibly welcoming at both sites. The staff were very accommodating and helpful. They took time out of their days to also share their rich information about this particular issue, and they connected us to the right patients at each of the two sites. So also want to thank the administrative staff at Serenity Lane who coordinated the visits, in particular Dr. Geisler, who really helped to set everything up. I also want to thank the NDEWS staff, particularly Dr. Eric Wish, Erin Artigiani, Amy Billing, and Marwa Al Nasser, who have helped to coordinate both the hotspot study and kind of get things rolling in conjunction with the larger reports. I also want to thank Mary Howe, who conducted site visits and interviews with me. And I know there's some people at this webinar who know both of us. So you also know that we spent, you know, the evenings hanging around at the needle exchanges and looking at some of the crisis interventions that were also happening in the area. So we were able to contextualize this by getting a sense of what that broader service landscape looks like in terms of harm reduction or places where people who use drugs who are not in treatment might be hanging out. And so we did, you know, garner a lot of that additional ethnographic information on that site visit. And also want to thank our funders, NIH, NIDA. Okay. So I will be kicking it back to Erin. I put a link in the PowerPoint to the full report of findings and then contact information, and really do welcome anyone to email me if they want to discuss further. So thank you.
All right, thank you so much. We really appreciate both of your presentations, Dr. Lopez and Dr. Geisler. I think that you have provided everyone with a wealth of valuable information. And I'm sure that it has engendered a lot of thought and discussion amongst our viewers. And I can see that most everyone actually has stuck around and has started sending in some questions, which is great. So just want to remind you all to please submit your questions in writing using the Q&A box. And also let you know that we will be posting a recording of this webinar along with a copy of our presenter slides on the NDEWS website, which one more time is ndews.org, so you can look for it there. And I'm going to move on to our Q&A session now. And to start with, we have a question from a participant who asked for all of the prior fatal overdoses among patients you interviewed and did focus groups with opioid-related overdoses.
Thank you. So that's a good question. So because we didn't collect systematic data on that, that's a question that I can't answer in terms of knowing for certain if they were specifically opioid overdoses. So Dr. Geisler might be able to shed a little bit more insight from kind of that period in reference at Serenity Lane, but we didn't collect specific data on the nature of the overdoses they were discussing.
We don't have that data either. Anecdotally, the vast majority of the overdoses we're aware of were opiates, but I don't have any data to support it.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Our next question is, did your study include any experience with pregnant women? Any special insights on working with this population?
Yeah, some of the original samples were collected from pregnant patients. My recollection was 2 or 3 of those patients were pregnant at the time of collection. We always get an obstetrical consult at the time of admission so that they can access care locally if needed. And then our standard of care is to provide MAT Suboxone for pregnant patients. We do not try to taper them to abstinence off opiates while they're pregnant.
And in terms of the qualitative study, we didn't have any people enrolled in the study or focus groups who were pregnant.
Okay, I'm not sure that the 2 of you will be able to answer this next question. It may be more appropriate for our colleagues at the High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area Program or at the Drug Enforcement Administration, but in case you might have some insights, I will throw it out to you. It's from a sergeant at the Edmonton Police Service who asks, would you be able to comment on the percent of quantity of meth to heroin when drugs were co-used? Did you have any sense of how people were determining when to use or how much to use?
To speak to the findings in the hotspot study, I would say that, one of the things that was interesting is because people were mostly, discuss the specific strategies around titrating or detoxing or other things, that the idea of co-use for at least people enrolled in this qualitative sub-study was more about consecutive use. So it wasn't necessarily like people were goofballing per se, or injecting simultaneously, but people were going back and forth strategically in order to either manage their high one direction or another, in order to manage daily activities, in order to manage anxiety or effects from withdrawal. So that was, at least in our sub-study, the kind of trend that I saw, which was not co-using in conjunction, like in one shot or something, but really using consecutively, like in one event.
Okay, thank you for that. I'll move on to a few more questions that have come in. And in the meantime, I'm also going to launch our brief poll because we always like to get some feedback on how useful our attendees found the webinar and how likely you are to recommend it to others and what you'd like to hear about in the future. So I will launch that now. And so I hope that you will take a few minutes to answer those questions for us. And I'll go back to our next question, which is, in the areas where logging work occurred, did you find the methamphetamine users were also co-using opioids, or did they exclusively use methamphetamine?
So this is actually, I think, a good area for further research or further discussion, which is, in the context of this, it was really presented to us as the logging industry being an important contextual factor that people cited. So to say, in particular geographic areas, if you're interested in knowing about people's patterns of methamphetamine use over time, then the logging industry is an important contextual factor to think about. So for us, we didn't specifically look at the logging industry and what people involved in the logging industry were necessarily doing. So none of our participants identified as people who worked in the logging industry, but more discussed it as an important contextual factor to be mindful of that was important within the local context. So like, let's say if we were going to design, a broader sort of regional study that looked at regional relationships in these pockets, we might, sort of target and say the specific communities that were historically logging communities where that kind of employment infrastructure was no longer there, and we might do some purposeful sampling within that. But I think from the data that we have now, we can't really comment on that question because it was more kind of this contextual, hey, you guys, pay attention to this as being a historical and contextual factor in relationship to meth use in the area.
Is there any emerging data on effective treatment of treating the co-use of stimulants and depressants?
My answer to that is not that I'm aware of. We're still struggling to get the majority of opiate patients on MAT and lower the overdose rate. What we're seeing is a lot of patients that are successful with MAT then start using methamphetamine as a vehicle for impairment.
Did participants describe different varieties of methamphetamine circulating in Oregon, or did it all seem to be qualitatively consistent in terms of strength, appearance, etc.?
Yeah, so again, over the course of the 2 days, we didn't in particular hear about sort of specific varieties or particular sort of like little pockets within the area where people describe that you could get, you know, stronger drugs here or there. So we didn't hear about those types of nuances. People, at least in our sample, spoke fairly kind of similarly across all participants. So didn't really discuss necessarily those kind of pockets, but again, you know, within the kind of realities of a 2-day site visit, I'm sure there is some kind of diversity in terms of that, but in terms of our sample, we didn't hear sort of specific nuances of those differences.
Yeah, I can say that we're aware of some of those nuances and differences, perceptions of our patient population, but I don't think this study captured that. And I'm not sure if that was just the sampling we did or whether it just didn't come up in the context of the conversations.
This one is, how did participants report that they learned about these strategies of co-use?
Yeah, so I think that other people, you know, some people had described being, you know, quote unquote, turned on to one drug or the other through partners or social networks. But really a lot of people, in particular the young people in the case studies, were like, yeah, this is just sort of the ubiquitous way that we do everything, right? So there wasn't this sense of, you know, uniqueness or surprise, but that just like in the context of people, you know, enjoying or preferring polysubstances for whatever reasons, that methamphetamine and heroin were kind of always part of this equation. So we didn't hear any narratives about people being like quote unquote initiated into the co-use, but that because the drugs were around, because methamphetamine was widely around as people reported, that it was just something that kind of was inevitably incorporated. But people didn't describe like an individual or someone that had, you know, taught them how to mix things, but more just about like, you know, I know the sort of differences and impacts of, you know, introducing stimulants if I'm using opioids. And so within the context of that, then sort of making those decisions. But no one really described kind of like a formal initiation or formal like teaching moment where someone had, you know, quote unquote, turned them on to that.
Yeah, we did hear some comments that I recollect about it just depended on what the dealer had, that sometimes the dealer would encourage them to try it as well. If they were experiencing, you know, too much sedation from their heroin, the dealer, if they had methamphetamine, might suggest that they try that. More of a dealer trying to make a better sale to the customer. We've heard those kind of comments.
Thank you. So our last two questions relate to stigma. And the first one is, were stigmas related to methamphetamine use gendered in any way? Do either of you have a sense or any information you can share about that?
Yeah. So I don't think any specific stuff about gender is in the report. We do intend to do an enhanced analysis where, you know, this we wanted to sort of release an initial analysis and report with the findings, but we intend to do kind of enhanced analysis over the next few months. And so I know that one case study in particular, her kind of experience of access to drugs and other things was very much related to gender, and very much having a partner who kind of had opinions or dictated what drugs she used and when. And so in the context of that, some of her decision making process happened in the context of that particular relationship. I'm, you know, again, trying to sort of think about the issue of stigma and thinking through the kind of gender dynamics. I think what stood out most for me in terms of stigma was really in relationship to associations that people were making between methamphetamine use and socioeconomic class. So this idea of poverty and this notion that quote unquote poor people use methamphetamine and that there's particular dangers and behaviors that end up getting associated with that and stigmatized. So that was the sort of perception that people discussed, not specifically around gender, but again, I'm sure that if we sampled more broadly and had gender sort of as an interest that we wanted to pursue, that we'd likely find things on that. But really ours was focused most on that socioeconomic stigmatization, stereotyping connected to the perception of methamphetamine users as being from poor socioeconomic backgrounds.
Yeah, I'm not sure the comments made it into the study, but I recollect comments about transitioning to injection from other methods of use, that people's comments where their behavior changed dramatically after they crossed the boundary of injecting either of the drugs.
All right, and our last question is, did participants, particularly those that use methamphetamine, provide feedback on what treatment provider settings can do to reduce the sense of stigma they feel experience to enhance their comfort with seeking and receiving support?
I think along the lines of, again, like people, there was some discussion around, you know, a lot since we were in a treatment context, you know, thinking about what it's like to manage both of these in treatment contexts, even within like what it's like to manage your body, you know, so some appreciation that, you know, people whose primary drugs of choice are different have even different ways of like managing a space, right? So that, you know, potentially a way in which someone who's an opioid user might have particular needs around even just the physical setting, but that methamphetamine users just, there was a few descriptions of wanting just a little bit more kind of understanding about even the different kind of bodily needs in that context, you know, different ways of engaging in a space, different ways of, you know, sitting in a chair, whatever, things like that. And just wanting people to be mindful that, you know, even in those contexts as people are managing like the initial moments of treatment, that there are these sort of like important kind of bodily needs around comfort and other things that might look different for different people. And so in the context of one of the case studies sort of saying that, you know, that people on MAT was particularly triggering from her because they were nodding off. You know, she discussed a little bit more about kind of like her spatial needs within the context of having been a methamphetamine user. And so just some of those sort of attentions to like compassion, even around small kind of little spatial things, but that actually make a big difference in that context.
All right, well, thank you again, Dr. Geisler and Dr. Lopez. I really appreciate you participating in our webinar this afternoon, and thank you to everyone else who joined us as well for listening in and submitting your thoughtful questions and comments. We appreciate all of the information that we got today, and we look forward to seeing all of you again at our next webinar on October 29th at 2 p.m., which will be about the perceptions of naloxone among recent opioid users, and will feature the results of research conducted in 3 sites across the United States. So keep an eye out on the NDEWS network and the NDEWS website for registration for that, and we look forward to seeing you again next time.